Let's talk about the Lummi Island, Willow's Inn, Blaine Wetzel scandal that is going down right now. And the ripples are still happening, whether or not it's on your Twitter feed or in the news, because a ton of you folks sent this to me. It's clearly a close-to-home story for me personally. Lummi Island is just a short drive and ferry ride away from me here in Seattle, and I'll absolutely be starting the story with some full transparency. One, no, I have never eaten at the Willow's Inn. Two, yes, one of my best friends in the world and previous Emulsion podcast guest, John Miller, has been working there through COVID, basically. And he was kind of like wine director, then moved to beverage manager and, dabbled in some other front of house management stuff. And when he got the news that all this was happening, and after seeing Blaine's response specifically, and I'm kind of, paraphrasing from phone calls I've had with him, he has since given his resignation, so he's not working at Willow's Inn anymore. He saw what was happening, and he just kind of, gave his notice. And overall, there's kind of two schools of thought here in Seattle from my boots-on-the-ground perspective, from me seeing friends of mine posting on Twitter and having some one-off conversations. One, Lummi Island is either this mind-blowing, completely novel experience, and it's completely worth the time to get there and the price you pay for the whole shebang. And the opposite, I don't find that there's a lot of people that are in between. And the opposite, which tends to be, it's incredibly disappointing, they're trying too hard, they're this wannabe Scandinavian place, it's too overrated, etc. And I'm breaking this into three sections for this piece because it's such an exhaustive article and there's so much we could talk about. This could be its own podcast. I want to talk about the article contents, I want to talk about Blaine's response specifically, and then I want to give some additional context and dig into some of the individual points here. So let's read a bit of the story. The title is, "At Blaine Wetzel's Willow's Inn, Employees Report Years of Workplace Abuse." And then there's another kind of like subtitle to the article, but let's talk about some quotes. Quote, "Since he took over the kitchen at the Willow's Inn," this is talking about Blaine, "it has become a global destination, fully booked nearly every night of its annual season from April to December. Culinary pilgrims come for multi-course dinners of foraged dandelions, custards infused with roasted birch bark, and salmon pulled from Pacific waters they can see from the dining room. After dinner, they float up to one of the luxe rustic bedrooms and wake up to wild blackberries and long-fermented sourdough." And then it continues to say, quote, "Beyond the food, they come for the story and pay at least $500 to live in it for a night." And end quote, because I want to give some context. You can get back to Seattle, but like the timing of the ferries conflicts sometimes with the ending of the meal. And so for most people, it's just more practical to stay on the island. And so it's this kind of combination of you have the meal and then you stay it's an inn, you book a room and you stay for the night. Quote, going back into the article, quote, "But 35 former staff members who spoke to the New York Times said that story, the one that Mr. Wetzel tells to diners, to the media, and to aspiring chefs who come to Lummi to learn from him, is deeply misleading." End quote. Bum, bum, bum. Okay, I have one more quote, and then I'm going to get into some thoughts here. Quote, "For years, they said Mr. Wetzel's culinary pedigree and the Willow's idyllic image have hidden an ugly reality that includes routine faking of island ingredients, physical intimidation and verbal abuse by Mr. Wetzel, including racist, sexist, and homophobic slurs, and sexual harassment of female employees by male kitchen staff members. In March, the Willows agreed to pay $600,000 to settle a class action lawsuit after a 2017 federal investigation confirmed accounts of wage theft and other unfair labor practices." So basically alluding to, end quote, of course, alluding to the fact that this isn't their first time in hot water. And just kind of continuing on with this. They're not calling it a trend, but they're saying this isn't the first time that they've been, hit with something. So that's effectively the gist of the piece. Again, please read the article in full if you haven't already. And I'm not saying there isn't more, because there absolutely is, from stories from previous employees to the accusation from a guest that they were vegan and then they said that the restaurant served them a dish with animal product in it, to Blaine's responses themselves, which I will quote in a second. But I want to start with this kind of overarching take that I've seen people throw at this piece. That's effectively summed up by this kind of shrug and the statement, well, yeah, Lummi Island and Willow's Inn isn't the only restaurant in the industry that does this. Right? Effectively saying the Willows is getting the profile in the article and the New York Times thing and the mob called after them on the internet. But take any one of these issues and put enough industry professionals in a room together, and I can't imagine that hands wouldn't go up if you asked anyone who works at a place that allows for, let's call it physical intimidation. I think hands would go up. Verbal abuse, hands would go up. Sexual slurs or harassment, or the list goes on, right? And it doesn't always source consistently with the product that they're using, right? Is that the goal of this journalist? To kind of spend months researching this piece and interviewing 35 people and packaging it all up and dropping it like a missile on this place, hoping that the impact will cause all restaurants to change overnight? Possibly. I'm not sure. I do think it's clear that the individual instances that got reported, even if it's a class action lawsuit, didn't cause folks to not want to go to Lummi Island, right? 2017 happened and they clearly bounced back. They were just as busy as ever, so that was not enough to get people to, take a look more closely at their business practices or incentivize Lummi to want to, implement huge changes. And while those folks are right to say, this happens at a ton of places, why is Willow's Inn getting called out? There has to be two things in place in a situation like this, in my opinion. One, examples of this getting shared and, more importantly, condemned. So, looking at it as, actually, this is bad, we should not be doing this. And number two, paths towards redemption for the folks that are involved. And the first bit is happening here, right? In a way that has much more social and cultural backing compared to the days of, I think if anybody has ever read something like Kitchen Confidential, where, yes, the stories would be shared, but that was always just, part of the job, or, it comes with the territory, right? If you can't handle the heat, right? That's the classic anecdote. And if we want organizations to have a massively engaged, excited, positively attitude-oriented pool of talent to hire from, the condemning part has to happen too. Because someone coming up might get excited about this idea of, being in an intense environment that forces them to better themselves and, puts them under stress where they can prove that they have the mental fortitude to push through things. But, it has to be known that this is not okay, and we as an industry of professionals don't allow this, right? We can't gaslight people or try to spin it and say it never happened or say something like you don't understand, because we as a culture have done our fair share of behaviors in the past, and we look back and say, that wasn't the really most admirable behavior that we could have done, was it? And I'm sure you can think of examples yourself, but remember how we would just, in the past, allow smoking to happen in restaurants or on airplanes? There's, movies. There's current video footage of this happening. And it seems so disrespectful now if someone were to, pull out a cigarette and light it in the middle of a crowded restaurant. But that was just par for the course years ago, right? And that's an example of, culture can change. I know it's not exactly apples to apples, but culture can change relatively quickly as well. That was a recent memory, right? And you're absolutely seeing a little bit of that with the publication of this article. And, continuing on talking about the path to redemption piece, remember those are my two things. We have to share the stories and condemn them. And then two, there has to be a path to redemption. And I think this is something that I've continually hammered home before with some of you in private conversations and on previous solo podcasts. When so-and-so gets canceled or there's public outrage at XYZ person, and yes, we're going to get to Blaine's responses in a bit, because I'm not saying that he deserves to go right back to what he was doing. I think there has to be some sort of time to work on yourself, to step away from the environment that you're in, to delegate responsibilities that you might have to other people, to, if that's what's needed to keep the organization going, and then be able to share how the growth that you've experienced has put you in a place to be reinstalled and rehired at the in the role that you want. Right? There's a big thing at Shopify where all of the C-suite teams, basically all the executive leadership at the company, they have to get hired back for their current role. I think it's every year, every 2 years or something like that. And I think that that's a really interesting way to think about it is, can you go do the work that's required and then basically prove that you are in a good place to get reinstated in the role that you're in? I think that would be an interesting, way to go about it, because then kind of takes it as objectively as we can, understanding that there's going to be these subjective factors regardless. But, some people absolutely disagree here. And I can semi-empathize with not wanting to trust someone who has displayed certain types of behavior in the past. But in my view, it's the clearest and most humane way to actually move society forward and change the culture. Because what happens if we don't do it and people can just stay canceled? Then what happens, right? I don't think that gets often played out. It's very satisfying to just block someone or leave a hateful comment or do whatever, when in reality, like, there's a lot of pain that's often going on. And it's what is that quote? It's don't attribute to malice what you can attribute to stupidity. Sometimes people just don't know, or that's all they do know. They don't know what it's like to be more professional or be in an environment where this is not the way you have to act or behave. And, this idea that we'll never forgive them, or they don't deserve to cook anymore, or whatever statements might get thrown around, are so inflammatory on Twitter or in an Instagram story that it riles people up. And it's this kind of like, oh shit, kind of reaction when you see stuff like that, because you're like, I don't want that to happen to me. And when we see someone getting completely annihilated online, regardless of how fucked up their behavior was, it's not productive to just cast that person out of society and leave them for dead. I just don't think that's the way to do it. And notice I'm not saying there has to be this, public-facing, PR'd to death, YouTuber sobbing apology video that anybody has to post to, quote, prove they're sorry, right? Because that's not actually getting anything done either, right? The place we want to get to, I would hope, is to admit fault, actually admit you did something wrong. Don't gaslight yourself or anybody. Understand why it was wrong. Be able to, steel man the other side. Be able to say why it was hurtful or incorrect or whatever. And then do the work to learn how to be a better functioning professional. And for people that don't know about these like solo podcasts, I write everything out and then picture that I'm just, reading. I do the video for YouTube. And that's just because it makes me less of a rambling nutcase. But I think that world where there is a clearly, and it's not going to be exactly the same for everybody, but normalizing people going on a redemption path, I think that would be the kind of world that I would want to live in. But it wouldn't require these kind of scathing hit pieces to be written, because there would just be a conversation with leadership, right? They would say, hey, chef needs to take some time away. There are some issues he's working through, and he'll be back in 8 months. That's a clear path to redemption, not, oh, this editorial piece has to come out where they reveal all of the skeletons in our closet, and now that causes you to do that work. If we normalized this, and people saw it as like, hey, I'm actually really struggling with this. And again, listen to the time frames I'm talking about. 8 months. 8 months is a long time to work on yourself and go to, therapy or pick up an exercise routine or like whatever people have to do. There's different tools. But we still, as a culture, deciding what is enough and what is just kind of going through the motions to check the box, we're still deciding what that is. And so, please tweet at me or pop a comment below on YouTube with your thoughts on this. Because I want those two things. I would hope that those two things become a little bit more popularized. So let's move on to my point number 2. Let's talk about Blaine's comments, because there are 2 that were quoted that I'm going to quote here. And I want to read them and do my best to shed a little light on why people are so pissed off, and then hopefully distill some lessons from there. So the first quote is, quote, Wetzel said he had never used any racist language of any kind. Quote, my stepmom and brother are Chinese, my wife is Mexican, and anyone that would claim that I was racist is lying, end quote. That's what Blaine said. So the first quote, let me read the second quote too. Quote, Mr. Wetzel said, quote, I support female chefs with all my heart, so much so that I married one. That's in parentheses. Anyone that would claim that I don't support female chefs is lying, end quote. So the first quote, the piece about using racist language, denying it, calling the accusers a liar, and backing it up with other non-white people in his life as kind of like, see, I'm close to people that aren't white, I can't possibly be racist. It's not a great response. And the piece explains this a bit, saying that some of the Asian American employees, quote, used to laugh it off and give Blaine the benefit of the doubt, fully believing it was ignorance, end quote. Again, that's a little bit of our malice, stupidity piece. It's another one of those changes we're experiencing in culture. Like, to do an imitation of an accent or to call someone a slang term that culture has created for your race or where you come from, was so incredibly common when I started cooking over 10 years ago in kitchens. And I'm not talking about the really hurtful ones, but the jokey ones. And we're all coming around to now saying, hey, that's actually not okay to do anymore. And it makes people uncomfortable, right? And when that happens, words start to twist and get distorted. So the truly racist people, at least from what I'm noticing, latch on to those words or that behavior and use them as a proxy for being actually racist. What do I mean by that? So I'm half Indian, right? My dad's skin is absolutely browner than mine. My mother's genes were much stronger. My white mother's genes were much stronger than my dad's on skin tone. His nose, not so much. But people in high school, and especially when I went to school on the East Coast, used to call me Brownie. Like an Indian person that I went to culinary school with, she would call me Brownie as well. Did I take offense to that? No, not really. But when the way worse terms that people use to describe Indian people get completely blacklisted, and us as a society deem it's not okay to say these other words, the racists among us might take words like brownie and say them with the intent of those worse words. Am I making sense? I hope I'm making sense. And of course, I'm not giving Blaine a pass here, but that could be potentially what trying to play devil's advocate, and I know that can be incredibly annoying in situations like this, because it's easy just to say, oh, well, he's a racist. But was there an instance when he was thinking to himself, no, I've never used any racist language of any kind when responding to this article? Because to him, he was saying something with completely different intent. He said the words, he didn't mean them to be racist, but when you're talking to a New York Times reporter and the person says, hey, what did he used to say? And you say, well, he used to call me Brownie. And they say, hey, that's, a negative word that talks about your race. I heard other people saying Brownie in this other context. That's not so great. And the better response here, trying to keep it productive, should have been something to the effect of, and I'm not a PR person, so anybody that writes real PR stuff can rip apart this response. Something like, I spoke with my colleagues and peers. It was brought to my attention that my language was incredibly damaging to members of the team and to the guests. And I mean no ill intent by my words. Of course, if that's true, we don't know. He would have to mean it. Because either you said it or you didn't. It's not about whether you think it was racist or not here, right? It's about someone feeling like they're being discriminated against based on their race. And that's where I think his response with this quote fell short of the mark. So let's talk about the female chefs piece. I'll read it one more time. Quote, I support female chefs with all my heart, so much so that I married one. Anyone that would claim I don't support female chefs is lying. Okay, second quote. Marrying a female chef isn't supporting female chefs. I'll say it right there. Marrying a female chef is a personally motivated decision that you made based on who you want to spend the rest of your life with, not how you operate your business. Two very different things. There's actually this incredibly fascinating thing I read the other day, and I'm not being a lazy podcaster. I tried to Google this so I could give credit where credit is due. Nothing that came up matched, so someone comment or tweet at me if you have the research, but it was all about the dichotomy between areas of your life, where you can be the most organized line cook in the world. You've always got your station set up, you're super clean, you're organized, you make lists, but your living room is constantly a mess. Same person, two different areas of their life in very different states. Or, you're incredibly attentive with your colleagues and your clients at work, but you can't seem to communicate with your family, right? Same person, same action or behavior, communication, you thrive in one environment and you suck in another environment. And that's why I call a bit of bullshit on this response, because it's not the same thing to have married a female chef versus fostering a culture in your organization that prioritizes giving women leadership opportunities, or giving promotions based on, something like tenure or merit that would, people in the article have expressed frustrations on, or whatever types of structures and frameworks exist. Because a lot of that is having to unlearn, and this is me projecting potentially, but Blaine observed a lot in other people's kitchens, and that's what he took to his own project. It was a very limited set of experiences when he started the island in, when was it? It was many years ago. He was 24, by the way, 23, 24. If there was no clear example of female leadership in his life, especially in professional kitchens, it's just this mental model that he's had built into his source code. And in such a male-dominated industry, you can go your entire career. You can cook for 35 years, 40 years, without ever working with a woman above you in the organization. And I suspect for someone who's so, what it seems like, ego-driven, this might be the reasoning behind the behavior. And again, I'm not excusing it or even, making an attempt to normalize it, but understanding it, like where does this come from, I think is maybe a better place to start. And this is very much so on Blaine, unfortunately, dictating the culture from the top down. There's a lot of work that's been done on that as far as researching company cultures, and does it come from the bottom up? Does it come from middle management? In as many, case studies as I've read and businesses that I've been trying to pay attention to and biographies I've read and, CEO interviews that I've been listening to, it's a top-down thing. It's very difficult to change the culture unless it's from top down. Let's keep going. Last up, this is maybe, some additional context, because I've never eaten at Willow's Inn before. Again, one of you forwarded me the email from the community. Thank you. You know who you are. Because I've never received any comms from them, and they sent out a mass email to everybody who's ever eaten at Willow's Inn before. So let's touch on, I think this might be just as important, not because I hope that any of you have to bail yourself out and do a whole PR thing because you're going to have a disaster someday, but there's so many. I read this and I was like, oh geez, this is not the right way to do it. And so I want to talk through this piece, this email that Willow's Inn sent to all of the guests, and we can dissect it a little bit. And I'm apologizing in advance if this is a bit long, but I want to read it and then intersperse my thoughts between it. So to start, quote, "We are so saddened by the stories from our former staff that were published in the New York Times last week. It has been extremely difficult to hear these accusations and read these comments from people that we worked with so closely for years. In the past several days, we have put all our time and energy into supporting our current team and our families." End quote. So right off the bat, super not good by literally passing the blame onto the staff and the New York Times. Right? Not only that, but what if you aren't on food Twitter, or you don't read Eater, or you don't keep in touch with what the Willow's Inn is up to, and you just went to go eat there in 2017 and you just haven't really read your emails from them, and now all of a sudden, that's how you're going to start this whole thing? Now, I, as a guest, have to go do my own research to hear what these accusations are. You're offloading that information source of truth to the New York Times. Not saying that New York Times is wrong, but it's starting off on the back foot. Also, I'm almost positive, and this is information from my friends that have worked there, they didn't close the restaurant. So that's also a bit of a strange statement, that they've been putting all their time and energy into supporting the current team. You could say that they're doing that so that they can, keep the paychecks going. But I have a feeling they did some sort of weird scramble with half of the staff because a lot of them left, and they had to keep accommodating the guests who were coming to the restaurant. So semi-weird to be doing two things. Not lying, but passing the buck, starting off on the back foot, and then again, misconstruing what you're saying when you're saying, oh, we've been working so hard and doing all our energy, blah, blah, blah. Going back into it, quote, "We recognize that the culture of our workplace in the past has caused people undue stress both emotionally and physically. The restaurant industry for too long has created a culture that applies an extreme amount of pressure on everyone involved to create perfection from a chaotic environment. The hours are too long, the margins are too thin, and the accepted norms of behavior are too extreme. While we want to defend ourselves for what we feel like is a biased mischaracterization of our team and our sourcing practices, it is much more important for us to take accountability for the past and create a better future. One point that must be clarified further is that no one on our team has ever reported sexual harassment or misconduct in the workplace to our management team. The sources from this article about those behaviors are absolutely devastating and can never be tolerated." End quote. Again, acknowledging the issues, but blaming it on the workplace, not individual people. Okay, right? Talking about the industry, trying to pass it off as, well, this is just how it is. And then this very strange, like, put up the shield, but then take it down kind of statement. We want to defend ourselves, but we're not going to. I don't really back that, because if the journalist is reporting inaccurately, say that. Defend yourself. Getting mad that the journalist is writing about your mismanaged organization, now that's another thing. Misreporting and actually telling stories about things that have happened are two very different things. It's also super fucked up that the one thing that they attempt to defend basically has no legs to stand on. If your manager is the one that's sexually harassing you, how are you supposed to come in, sit them down for the conversation, and report them to themselves? So it's like they yes, you're right. No one reported it. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Let's keep going. Quote, "In recent years, we have made intentional efforts to improve our hiring practices, provide HR support for our team, and maintain a supportive and creative environment. We've adapted our schedules to give employees shorter workdays and more time off and better wages. In addition, we are bringing an HR representative in-house to help support our team and provide them with an outlet for any issues. We also plan to provide further education and training for our management team in the areas of leadership, inclusion, and diversity. Moving forward, we will also create a paid internship program with free housing to create better opportunities for a wider range of backgrounds in our kitchen. This work must continue and will be the priority for all of us. The Willow's Inn and the industry as a whole needs to rally in support of the amazing individuals and create memorable experiences every night for guests around the world. No one from any level of experience or department should be treated with anything but the utmost respect for their dedication to hospitality. It is our mission to move forward with the intentional gratitude and graciousness that will make our families, colleagues, and community proud." End quote. And so it's more deflecting, more attempting to like straw man themselves, saying, look, we can't be that bad. We shortened our work days, right? That's not what the accusations are about, dude. Also, the management training is solid. The paid and subsidized internships programs are great. And I'm hopeful that this can all result in positive change. I really, really do hope that. Like, this isn't worth pointing fingers and watching the car crash happen if it doesn't result in lessons for all of us. And so I'll share one last musing that I've kind of been thinking about. You're coming off a stint of working at some great restaurants. Most of them abroad. You're incredibly inspired by what you experienced, and you see an opportunity that's got some promise. And so you open your own place, and you're 24. And one of the reasons that people are drawn to you is because you have this pedigree. You've worked at some great places. Plus, you happen to use some local products, something you learned at some of these great places. And you want to make a name for yourself, so instead of using that pedigree as your competitive advantage, it needs to be your ingredients now. Combo that with the fact that when the critics start to come, I'm using a piece from Bill Addison as an example in this quick story. He shares in his piece that, quote, "At this time of year, when the harvests are generous and the fishermen's nets steadily come in full, around 80% of the food that Wetzel serves will come from this 9 square mile island," end quote. And when these critics that come to see you have their meal, and they ask you, "Hey chef, what makes you so special? What's your philosophy? We've heard all these great things about you." And you have this feeling that you have to keep that shtick going. Because what do you have if you take away the exclusiveness of the ingredients? You have this ego that says you don't want to rely on, you're just the chef that worked at so-and-so. So then, again, I'm trying to play this chess game out. You start thinking, why should guests drive and get on a ferry to stay overnight if I'm not using these ingredients? And then the doubt sets in. And then you get scared. And then you're on edge at work. And then you need to blow off steam, so you get drunk after service. And then you're more on edge the next day, because you're hungover, and you say something rude and offensive to someone as a snap. And then when all the pressure is on you to do the PR, and write the menus, and manage the staff, and do the books, if you aren't equipped to handle that, This kind of stuff, all the previous scandals they've been a part of, that happens. And all of that is said to say, Blaine isn't a bad person. Blaine, the person, at that stage of his life, in that environment, with those types of pressures and lack of understanding, did bad things. And it sucks. Because Willow's statement is semi-correct. Those behaviors can never be tolerated. But they were tolerated. And now it's on them to see where we go from here. I actually have a couple comments in the Circle community that I kind of want to poke through real quick, because I want to share some, thoughts that weren't mine. For everybody that doesn't know, I post in the industry news space in the community. I will just share the piece, and then you folks can comment on it and let me know your thoughts, and then I use it as kind of when I'm writing these sorts of things. So, quote, Jordan says, "I think these stories can provide valuable lessons for the new generation of chefs. This is the reality of various places in the industry, and I think there's hope for some positive change." And then he does clarify, "These allegations in that story go far beyond any typical rough kitchen environment. The nasty stories from this place never seem to end." Tyler says, quote, "Super disappointed after reading this article. I've read both of his books, and until now I've truly wanted to go and work there in some capacity. The denial on Blaine's part makes me lean even more into being in the camp with all the past employees." Zach says, quote, all that being said, I'm definitely in the disappointed camp. It's a heartening feeling when your bubble bursts and your image of someone shatters." And then there's a couple more comments, but I'll spare them. If you want to check those out, they're always available. That's one of the best parts about this new piece of software, is that it's more evergreen. So you can go back and you can look at previous posts, which is really, really nice.